Hello friends, my name is Professor Filip Kovacevic and this is the 11th edition of the Russian newspaper's Monitor. I hope you are doing well today and have a lot of exciting plans for the holidays. I wish you all the best in the coming year. Let's make our Newsbud community bigger and stronger yet. So let's begin our weekly roundup of the Russian newspaper stories. As we typically do, we will begin with Rossiyskaya Gazeta, the Russian government-owned newspaper, the edition for December 14, 2016. There are no international politics news on the front page, but on page 2, there is a long and important interview that Vladimir Putin gave to Japanese journalists on the eve of his visit to Japan on December 15, 2016. According to the article, in this interview, Putin stated that Russia would like to normalize completely the relations with Japan. He said that the absence of a peace treaty is an anachronism, but that compromises are needed from both sides. The key topic of the discussion between Japan and Russia has been the fate of 4 islands, in fact 3 islands and a group of islets, known as the Southern Kurils, which were taken over by the Soviet Union at the end of the World War II. Japan wants the islands back, while the Russians want greater economic investments from the Japanese, and of course the complete lifting of the anti-Russian economic sanctions that Japan imposed in solidarity with the United States and the European Union. The article reports that Putin will initially meet with the Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe in Abe's private residence in Nagato. This is the 4th meeting of the 2 leaders this year, which shows the importance they both assign to direct face-to-face negotiations. The initial meeting will take place in an informal setting, and this, according to Putin, might lead to more flexibility in coming to an agreement on important geopolitical and economic issues. The next day, the negotiations will move to Tokyo. The article states that the representatives of prominent Japanese and Russian companies will also be included in some of the meetings, and that certain economic agreements will be signed. Putin is also scheduled to visit a judo center, as it is well known that he is a judo master. In fact, in the interview, Putin praises the qualities of judo not only as a sport, but also as a philosophy of life, especially in terms of the respect it is given to the opponent. The thorniest issue to be discussed is, of course, the issue of the islands. Putin recalled that in 1956, Japan and the Soviet Union signed the declaration that called for first signing the peace treaty and then for the 2, not 4 islands to be returned to Japan. However, the declaration did not specify under whose sovereignty the islands will be and under what conditions. It was ratified by both Japanese and Soviet parliaments, but the Japanese government later pulled out of the deal, and the territorial issue remained unresolved. The key question is whether it will be any different this time around. Can Putin and Abe come to an agreement? According to the article, Putin stressed that it was important to establish the climate of trust. The Russians feel that they have been deceived by the West several times in the last 2 decades and are now wary of making any concessions to anybody. The Japanese, on the other hand, want all 4 islands, not only 2. This is why they are reluctant to sign the peace treaty under the terms of the 1956 declaration. However, at the same time, I think it is unrealistic to expect Putin to agree to return of all 4 islands. In the interview, Putin explained that Russia was successful in resolving territorial issues with China by putting economy and economic cooperation first. He stated that today China is Russia's biggest trading partner, and that the economic and political convergence between 2 countries will become even more visible in the coming years. As I said many times before, this is a nightmare for the traditional British-US geopolitics. No wonder that Henry Kissinger recently visited China and met with the Chinese President Xi Jinping. According to the article, Putin stated that he was willing to consider the humanitarian aspects of the southern Kuril situation and, for instance, allow visa-free travel for the Japanese originally from the islands. At the same time, however, he was clear that he expected the Japanese side to reciprocate economically. One of the discussed options will be the joint economic projects on the islands. The key issue, however, is the lifting of the anti-Russian sanctions. Japan is obliged to follow the US line on the sanctions, as it has no direct interests either in Ukraine or in Syria. In my opinion, it will be very interesting to see whether the Prime Minister Abe will be willing to abandon his long-term American supporters on this issue in order to receive the concessions from the Russians. As I see it, this is exactly the card that Putin is playing on. His main goal is to break up the united Western Front on anti-Russian sanctions. This is why he is willing to offer a kind of carrot to Abe, who needs it for domestic political reasons, and also for making a significant mark on contemporary Japanese history. Now, it is up to Abe to decide what is more important: the interests of the Western community as defined by the United States, or the Japanese own geopolitical and national security interests. Now, let's take a look at the front page of Nezavisimaya Gazeta, the middle-of-the-road newspaper, the edition for December 14, 2016. In the right bottom corner of the front page, there is an article on Syria under the title, "The loss of Palmyra will delay the withdrawal of the Russian troops." The subtitle explains that the Syrian army seems incapable of holding the recently retaken territories. The article begins by stating that the battle for Aleppo has reached its climax. According to the Iranian media, the Syrian government has established almost total control over the city. However, at the same time, the surprise attack of the Islamic State forces led to the retreat of the government troops from Palmyra, the site of ancient archaeological treasures. According to the article, this raises difficult questions for the Russians. The article reports that the government forces liberating Aleppo are now focused on more systematic cleansing of the recently taken city blocks from the militants. The United Nations official Rupert Colville, as well as the French Foreign Minister Jean-Marc Ayrault, claimed that dozens of civilians also came under attack. However, neither the UN nor the French Foreign Ministry considered the possibility that perhaps these civilians were in fact militants in civilian clothes. the TV channel Al Arabiya, which is under the control of Saudi Arabia, claimed that hundreds of civilians, including women and children, were executed by the Lebanese militant organization Hezbollah, as well as by the Shiite rebels. In addition, the pro-Saudi Syrian opposition remained belligerent. Its leader, Riyad Haddad, said at a press conference in Paris that the Syrian president Bashar al-Assad would be wrong if he assumed that the fall of Aleppo would lead to any kind of concessions by the opposition. The article also quoted the former US ambassador to Syria and Saudi Arabia, Richard Murphy, who agreed that the militants were not ready to recognize the defeat and that their fight would go on. In my opinion, these statements are completely predictable. The outside players supporting the Syrian rebels are not willing to give them up as yet. They are not ready to face the music of their colossal geopolitical failure and millions of dollars wasted. They will simply open or reopen some other front in Syria or elsewhere, as can be witnessed by numerous, almost simultaneous terrorist attacks in Turkey, in Egypt, and in Nigeria. In fact, according to the article, the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov did not exclude the possibility that the attack on Palmyra was planned in order to take the Syrian government attention away from Aleppo and allow the militants there time to escape and regroup. Though this strategy in general appears to have failed, Palmyra has been lost once again by the Assad troops. The article quotes the Russian professor and expert on the Middle East, Leonid Isayev, who said that Palmyra was not as symbolically important for Assad as Aleppo, and that it would not be difficult for the Syrian army to take it over again. However, the loss of Palmyra also revealed a serious military weakness of the Syrian troops, which means that Russia would need to remain militarily involved for a longer period than many expected. Isayev, for instance, stated that while earlier he believed that the Russian forces should withdraw from Syria after the fall of Aleppo, now he was not sure about that anymore. He advised the Syrian army not to rush into trying to liberate more territories, such as, for instance, by attacking Idlib, but to focus on regrouping and holding on to what it had retaken so far. He also warned that the Islamic State and its allies were planning to advance toward Homs and other government-controlled territories in the central part of the country. In my opinion, this article demonstrates the difficulty of attaining a lasting peace in Syria, even with Assad's victory in Aleppo. There are still too many outside players who stand to profit from the continued war and social chaos in Syria. This means that without an agreement among the great powers and their reining in the appetites of their proxies, we may not witness the coming down of violence in Syria, and the situation may get even worse by new front lines being activated, including the instability in the Balkans and the terrorist attacks in Europe. As Putin said recently, the Russian and the Chinese are eagerly waiting to see the Syrian policy of the new Trump administrations. Much depends on that. Trump will have to make radical changes, or the world will be again on a fast track to a much bigger, perhaps even a nuclear confrontation. Next, we'll go to the front page of Izvestia, the moderate pro-government newspaper the edition for December 13, 2016. On the right side of the front page, there is a title in quotation marks. Human capital will help us solve all the problems. The subtitle explains that the article is the interview with the physicist, Dr. Mikhail Kovalchuk, who is the corresponding member of the Russian Academy of Sciences and the director of a well-known Kurchatovsky Institute. The motive for the interview is the Russian strategy for scientific and research development until 2035, recently signed by the President Vladimir Putin. So let's look at how the Russians envision the progress of their scientific and technological potential in the next 20 years. According to Kovalchuk, the whole humanity is now experiencing a very serious crisis which calls into question its very survival on Earth. The present Western economic model of consumerism has led to severe shortages of resources. Kovalchuk thinks that this model is unsustainable and that it is inevitably bound to crash in the next few decades. The wars for energy resources have been going on for some time, and what is taking place in the Middle East at this time is the proof of that. However, Kovalchuk notes that whereas in the past the colonization was essentially a military process, today it is replaced by the imposed technological dependency supported by the military force, and among its victims one also finds the economically advanced countries. Kovalchuk states that what is necessary is to develop a completely new approach to technology, as well as to the use of natural resources on Earth. In this respect, he praises the speech given by Putin at the last year's United Nations General Assembly annual meeting, in which Putin emphasized both the tactical and strategic priorities that need to be agreed on by the international community in order to come up with the way out of the present crisis before it is too late. The example Kovalchuk offers is the way the tremendous Soviet victory against the Nazis in Europe in 1945 was quickly overshadowed by the new nuclear weapons technology that the United States used against Japan. The Soviet victory was based on conventional weapons and was the result of short-term tactical priorities. However, had not the Soviet Union also begun to focus on long-term strategic goals and develop its own nuclear weapons, its victory against Nazism would soon be rendered meaningless by the overwhelming advantages that the new weapon provided to its new Cold War opponents, the United States and the UK. In other words, Russia today, just like the Soviet Union previously, must think beyond the day-to-day political and geopolitical issues and get its population ready for the challenges and technologies of the coming decades. In this respect, the strategy document signed by Putin puts the main emphasis on developing the human intellectual resources of the Russian population. Kovalchuk mentions several projects specifically designed to nurture talented children from all over Russia and provide them with superb education and resources so that the development and refinement of their talents could lead to new inventions and discoveries benefiting not only Russia, but also the entire world. With regard to this, Kovalchuk describes in detail programs developed and implemented by the institute he directs. In my opinion, this was the main reason why Izvestia chose to interview him and not somebody else about the new strategy. Kovalchuk further states that the Russian state needs to increase its investment in science and development. He knows that today Russian scientists participate in many international projects, such as, for instance, the CERN laboratory in Switzerland, but that this should be no substitute for the similar grand projects on the territory of Russia. This particularly applies to all projects that have or may have points of contact with the matters of national security. Kovalchuk specifically mentions 4 such mega projects, including one on the grounds of his institute in Gatchina near St. Petersburg, which includes the operations of the most powerful neutron research reactor in the world. In fact, there are so many scientific and infrastructural projects being set up rapidly around St. Petersburg at this time that there is already a name given to this regional mega construction: the Imperial Circle, a window to Europe of the 21st century. In my opinion, the Russian strategy for the scientific and technological development until 2035 shows that the Russian government will get deeply involved in the shaping of intellectual and other resources of its population. This strategy, just like any other promulgated in recent months and years by Putin and his supporters, such as, for instance, the strategy on national defense or the strategy on information security, only reflects this statist, populist line of thinking. We'll stay with this edition of Izvestia for December 13, 2016, and look at the top of page 2. Here we find an article on the Russian-led military alliance, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, which is better known under the Russian acronym ODKB. The title of the article is ODKB Prepares a Response to NATO. The subtitle explains that the Collective Security Treaty Organization will discuss the increased activities of NATO in Eastern Europe. This article is accompanied by a photograph showing the heads of state of the 6 countries that at this time make up the organization: Russia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Armenia. The article reports that the leaders of the ODKB countries are scheduled to meet at the end of December to discuss possible responses to the accelerated militarization of Eastern Europe by NATO. The article presents an interview with the General Secretary of ODKB, Nikolai Bordyuzha. Bordyuzha stated that the member states of ODKB are concerned by the fact that NATO is bringing in 4 military battalions into Eastern Europe and that the entire border toward Russia is militarizing. He claimed that ODKB must react to that, considering that this greatly affects the national security of its members. The Belarus president, Alexander Lukashenko, also spoke about the importance of ODKB military planning. He stated that military specialists of the member states are already making plans for joint activities. Belarus will take on the presidency of the organization next year. Also starting next year, there will be a new procedure for the selection of the General Secretary. The position will rotate among member states on an annual basis, which was not the case so far. The article quotes the well-known Russian military expert Mikhail Alexandrov, who said that the ODKB must now work on developing more concrete agendas and programs in which the member states would act together. He, for instance, suggested that the ODKB could organize the delivery of humanitarian aid to Syria. This would be its first military operation outside of the post-Soviet space and would definitely cause a lot of irritation in NATO circles. At this time, the ODKB is conducting various joint anti-terrorist exercises in its member states. Other Russian experts interviewed in the article agreed that the expansion of its activities is urgently needed. In my opinion, the article shows that Russia is hard at work to set up a military bloc in Eurasia that would rival NATO. It has started gathering the former Soviet republics, but its ambitions will not end there. Already various countries outside of the ex-Soviet Union are interested in acquiring the observer status in the organization. For instance, Afghanistan and Serbia have already been granted this status. I expect this trend to continue and intensify in the future. The eventual addition of China or Iran, and perhaps in the much longer run also Turkey, if it ever leaves NATO, would dramatically change the geopolitical, military, and intelligence situation in Eurasia and present a dramatic challenge to NATO influence in Europe and the world in general. Lastly today, I will add one more newspaper to the list of Russian newspapers I am discussing in the show. This newspaper is called Trud, which in Russian means labor. During the Soviet days, it was the newspaper of the Soviet trade unions and had one of the largest circulations in the world. At this time, Trud is owned by a group of Russian oligarchs who are moderately critical of the economic policies of the Russian government. The article that I will focus on is in the middle part of the front page in the edition for December 9, 2016. It deals with the prices of the basic products in Russian supermarkets. There is a table that shows the increase in prices of various products, such as eggs, milk, butter, and meat, from December 2015 to November 2016. The immediate motive for the article is the recent announcement of the Russian Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev, who, as I argued in one of my recent articles for Newsbud, is on his way out of the government and will likely be replaced by Putin's old KGB colleague Nikolai Patrushev. Medvedev stated that the prices for goods and services in Russia increased only 5% since December 2015. However, the author of the article, Vitaly Golovachev, decided to check Medvedev's statement. He compared the receipts he had from various products he purchased in December 2015 with the receipts for the same products purchased at this time. The place of purchase was the same, one of the huge supermarkets in a Moscow suburb. What Golovachev found out was that Medvedev was not telling the truth. The prices did not only increase 5%, but 11% on average, more than double from what Medvedev claimed. There were some products, the price of which increased 30%, but there were also others where the increase was much less, no more than 6% for eggs, for instance. Also, Golovachev noted that the price increases were lower for the products that one can consider essential for human diet. Some vegetables widely eaten in Russia, such as potatoes and cabbage, even got slightly cheaper, or their prices remained the same. This means that the government, in fact, exerts a great deal of control over the prices, which is yet another sign of the rapid renationalization of the Russian economy. No doubt, we will see more of the same in the future. According to Golovachev, the biggest concern for the ordinary Russians is not the increase of food prices, but the increase in the prices of basic medications. The prices for some medications have doubled since a couple of years ago. What is even more disturbing is that the same imported medications in Poland, for instance, are 2 or 3 times cheaper. This could be the result of the anti-Russian sanctions imposed by the European Union and the United States. And these sanctions are no doubt hurting the ordinary Russian consumer. In my opinion, this article represents an open critique of the policies implemented by the Russian government regarding the economic needs of everyday life. It is significant that Dmitry Medvedev was directly mentioned in connection with issues that obviously cause a lot of dissatisfaction among the Russian people. I read this as yet another indication that Medvedev has no political future. It could even be that some of his opponents in the Kremlin from the intelligence community stand behind this article and many similar ones in other newspapers. This, however, is not to say that the information is false, but only that its negative aspects are purposefully attached to Medvedev's name. In this way, he will be made to bear the brunt of the consequences. When Putin decides to fire him, it is likely that he will use things like this to justify his decision to the Russian public. And Medvedev will not be missed, for sure. Dear friends, this is all for today. Thank you for your time. Be cool and stay cool until the next edition of the Russian Newspapers Monitor.
If you found this video useful, share it. Newsbud presentations are only made possible by our viewers. Subscribe to newsbud.com today to become part of the Newsbud community, where soon you will find exclusive content only available to our subscribers.